In 1845, two ships set sail on a perilous journey to navigate the uncharted waters of the Canadian Arctic, but what followed was a harrowing tale of endurance, tragedy and mystery. Over 150 years after the ships went missing, a strange artefact was sold at an auction which was said to be lost at sea on one of the missing ships. How did it get there? Did the thieves find the wreckage well before researchers did? Join me on a journey into the frozen abyss as we unravel how the discovery may change the way we look at the haunting story of the Terror and Erebus, the ill-fated ships of the Franklin expedition. This is the story of the puzzling artefact that confused researchers for decades. Arnold 294. The Terror and Erebus expedition was a tragic voyage led by Sir John Franklin in 1845 to navigate the Northwest Passage in the Canadian Arctic. The reason for this trip was to map a shortcut for trade and commerce between Europe and Asia. The expedition consisted of 129 men who set out from England to explore the unknown Arctic waters, but it was a journey that would ultimately end in tragedy. The expedition started with a lot of issues, including several early casualties. The crewmen explained to their families how Captain Franklin had outlawed intoxication on board in their final letters home. Prince of Wales and Enterprise, two whaling ships, made their last observations of Erebus and Terror in July of 1845. After that, Erebus and Terror vanished from sight. The succeeding events are inferred from the testimonies of later explorers, scientists, and the indigenous Inuit people. The crew spent the winter of 1845 to 1846 tied off in Beechey Island, where three of them perished. John Torrington, William Brain, and John Harnell made up this crew. Their bodies were discovered in full preservation under the ice in 1974. They are regarded as one of history's best preserved mummies, photographed in detail, but I cannot show you that on YouTube. According to the findings, the three main reasons for death were pneumonia, lead poisoning, tuberculosis, and zinc deficiency and malnutrition respectively. Due to the significant amounts of lead detected in their hair and teeth, lead poisoning was first suspected as the cause of death for all three. This had been a major issue for this time period, as the lead from cans would oftentimes seep into the food after a long while. The two ships became stranded in the ice close to King William Island in the Canadian Arctic during the winter of 1847. They didn't go sailing again. Members of the crew realised their chances of living on board the ship were slim after spending a year trapped among icebergs and ice sheets, hoping in vain for the ice to melt. Franklin's exhibition party left notes on two pieces of paper which were discovered by William Hobson's McClintock Arctic exhibition in 1857 inside a cairn on King William Island. The information in these notes partially sheds light onto the Franklin party's conditions. The second of these letters, dated April 25, 1848, said that in addition to Sir Captain John Franklin's death in June of the previous year, 24 other shipboard passengers had also perished. Below are links to both notes. They vanished into thin air. On King James Island, human bones were later discovered during an expedition headed by archaeologist Owen Beatty in 1984. There's a lot of lead in these bones as well. They are believed to be the remains of Torrington's crewmates. A horrific possibility regarding the fate of the crew was revealed by the analysis of these bones. The remains of the crew of Franklin's ship bore the markings and indications of gnawing, indicating they had consumed their fallen comrades. Most of the crew members' remains, including Sir John Franklin's, were never discovered. What happened to the crew members who were left behind? Did they ever make it to Canada's mainland, or were they saved by a passing ship? Were the local Inuits able to save them, or did they die in the Arctic's frigid conditions? Where were the interred if so? Where are the bodies of the 126 members? These questions remain unanswered, and the Franklin expedition remains one of the deadliest Arctic disasters in history. Despite the tragedy, The expedition left a lasting legacy and trail of clues that have fascinated historians and adventurers for generations. The ships and their artefacts were lost for over 150 years, until several expeditions in the late 20th and early 21st centuries rediscovered the wreckage, revealing new insights into the fate of the crew and the challenges they faced. However, one artefact was found many miles from the wreckage, and most curiously, years before the wreckage was ultimately discovered. Arnold 294 started as a typical, unassuming chronometer. It was created by John Arnold, a clockmaker, as its name would imply. Chronometers are instruments that tell time precisely enough to be used on ships to determine their longitude at sea. Arnold 294 was consequently placed in the Royal Observatory so that any ship requiring it may check it out. It stayed there for many years before getting entangled in one of the biggest enigmas of polar exploration, the Franklin expedition. Numerous search expeditions have been organised to scour the Arctic in the nearly 200 years since the Erebus and Terror set sail, and several of them have brought back artefacts from sailors who perished. Plates, utensils, literature, and chronometers were among them. Arnold 294, though, was never identified as one of them. This item was originally associated with the trip on June 26, 1886, when the Royal Observatory's logbook was revised with a new entry that stated, "Lost in the Arctic regions with Erebus." When the observatory acquired an otherwise unremarkable carriage clock from an auction in 1999, this situation changed. When it was disassembled 10 years after it was first discovered, it was discovered that the clock had been constructed using an antique ship's chronometer. Its original name was flattened and replaced on the back of the clock with Reynolds & Sons, another clockmaker from the 19th century. However, the name seems to have been restored 30 years before the observatory got their hands on it, allowing it to once more read Arnold 294. Many theories have been put forth as to how this clock that was seemingly supposed to be on board these ill-fated ships wound up miles from the crash site and in the hands of antique collectors. The first and most likely scenario is that Arnold 294 was indeed retrieved from the Arctic by one of the searchers. It's possible that whoever discovered it decided to keep it for themselves and flatten the name to conceal this fact. However, there's a flaw with this idea. The senior horologist of the observatory, Jonathan Betts, who initially assisted in identifying the chronometer, states, "This has never been laying around in the open air. I've held a pocket watch that was found during the expedition, and it was so rusted that even opening the case was impossible. Due to the harsh Arctic conditions, this would have rusted in a day and become useless within a month." The chronometer may have been kept in a secure location by an especially considerate sailor, but it wouldn't have lasted for very long. Between the expedition's disappearance and the time that searchers reached King William Island, where the majority of the crew perished, several decades had passed. The Arnold 294 must have been stolen before the crew entered if it was never exposed to the Arctic, which is the second plausible explanation. The crew stopped at Disco Bay in Greenland before disappearing, making that location the most plausible spot for this to have occurred. 5 men were let go from this place, and they were all allowed to take it with them when they departed. Only one of the 5 men, Thomas Burt, the ship's armourer, was a native of the Erebus. Although no conclusive evidence has been discovered, there was someone named Thomas Anthony Burt that was arrested for housebreaking in London 5 years before the expedition's departure, which might corroborate him as the sort of character to take the artefact from the ship. Nevertheless, there are still some issues with this claim. 1. It would be very difficult for someone to just steal the chronometer from the ship. The person in charge of caring after them would probably be one of higher rank, because, as indicated, they are extremely valuable tools aboard an expedition vessel. It would also be quite challenging to keep them hidden for so long. A lost timepiece was not mentioned in any of the letters that the officers and crew wrote home while stationed at Greenland, Thus, whoever stole it from the Erebus in Greenland would have had to find a means to keep the majority of the crew from speaking out. One of the most peculiar aspects of this case is the lack of concrete proof that Arnold 294 was even on the voyage outside of the logbook. The fact that the record was last revised in 1886, 40 years after the ships vanished and 30 years after the Admiralty reported that all of the crew members were dead, is in fact quite puzzling. The answer might not lie with the Franklin's crew, but rather with the Royal Observatory of the 1880s, where someone wrote a note in the logbook to hide their tracks. Or it might have survived its time in the Arctic unharmed because Thomas Burt, or whoever it was, is just really good at stealing things. We're left with a lot of questions and few concrete answers, just like the rest of the journey. The Franklin's expedition's many mysteries have persisted for nearly 2 centuries since it vanished into the icy waters of the Arctic Ocean, and generations have passed since its wreckage. The answer to the puzzling story of Arnold 294 may ultimately be lost to time, but the cautionary tales learned from the expedition continue to prove timeless.